Hey there, my name is Megan and welcome to my channel, or welcome back. Today I'm going to be discussing some books that I recommend if you are trying to get back into reading. And the reason that I wanted to recommend these books is because I was an avid reader when I was in middle school, pretty much in high school. I remember being in high school and reading some of the Wheel of Time books, Terry Goodkind, George R.R. Martin. I remember reading Dune, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. So all of those very, very famous fantasy works I remember reading as a teenager. But then once I went off to college and graduated college and started working, my reading very much died off. And I didn't get back into reading until I was probably about 25 or 26 years old. So there was a good 7-year gap where I wasn't reading anything. And when I got back into reading, I really didn't know where to start. YA was a genre that had taken off and was being heavily marketed, and I just didn't know where to start. And one of the things that kind of helped me was I was actually working for a big box retailer at the time, and they sold books, and I would just see the books that we were selling because they sold mostly the popular titles, and that's the ones that I would pick up and read. And then that kind of segued into books that maybe weren't being sold by that big box retailer but were still popular. So I have read all of these books. These are the books that got me back into reading. And then I want to discuss some books that got me into reading specific genres. So like I said, I was a fantasy reader, but now I read sci-fi, now I read thrillers, I read contemporary/romance. I have expanded the genres that I read. So I want to discuss the books that got me specifically into reading those genres. So I will put timestamps down below for these specific genres that I skip around to. But before we go ahead and get on into the book recommendations, if you're not already subscribed to my channel, I would really love it if you hit that subscribe button, give my channel a little bit of support. Also, I am the author of Aftermath, a sci-fi mystery book that I would really appreciate y'all checking out if you enjoy that genre. It is available on Amazon via Kindle or paperback, and currently has a 4.7 rating on there. I will have all of this listed down in the description box below if you're interested in learning more. I'm going to start off with fantasy. These are the books that actually got me back into reading when I was about 25 years old. And the first one is actually the Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare. And it was actually one of my coworkers, a male, who was reading these books and recommended them to me. Like I said, I worked at a big box retailer and he was reading them. So I decided to pick them up, and I read the first 3 books and absolutely loved this series and quickly reread them. And I think what I love about this series so much, there's a couple different reasons. I had never read an urban fantasy at that time, so I really liked how Cassandra Clare incorporated fairies and warlocks and demons into an urban setting. I also really liked the writing style Cassandra Clare uses. She is very, very humorous, and her characters are a bit sarcastic at times. And I just found it at that age really enjoyable to read and funny, and it made me smile, and it was kind of like I was watching a sitcom. And in addition to that, the plot line was good. And then we have a forbidden kind of romance between the 2 main characters. So you have like a lot of different elements that Cassandra Clare used to really grip me with this story. And her world building is quite good. She has a whole history with the Shadowhunters and their creed and what they're proud of and what they do. And then she has the very, very strained relationships with the Fairy Queen and how they sometimes have to work together but don't really like each other. So Cassandra Clare does quite a good job world building and character developing and writing dialogue that makes the series fun and very accessible for someone who's trying to get into reading fantasy. And then the next book that got me into reading adult fantasy again was Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn. And I actually picked up this book at the bookstore, never knowing who Brandon Sanderson was. It just looked interesting and I just grabbed it, and it actually sat on my shelf for a little while before I picked it up. But once I picked it up, I quickly became immersed in this world. The reason that Brandon Sanderson is a good writer to get you into reading fantasy is because, just like Cassandra Clare, his writing is very accessible. And he has immaculate world building, and he takes you step by step through his world building to understanding his magic system, to seeing how all of it's interconnected. This book is very heavy in your traditional fantasy tropes. So we have a main character named Vin, a street urchin, who uncovers that she has this really powerful ability. And you also have a world being ruled by a tyrant king known as the Lord Ruler, who is very mysterious and can't seem to be killed. Vin is soon recruited by Kelsier, who is a thief, and he is creating a resistance to overthrow the Lord Ruler. So this series for me involved a ton of different elements that made it appealing, such as a really, really well-developed and interesting magic system with history and lore. We also have a lot of politics going on and a really, really mysterious backstory regarding the Lord Ruler that was a bit creepy, and I remember that's what kept me gripped through the next 2 books. We also have a found family trope with Kelsier's crew, as they are all depending on one another and support one another in order to achieve their goals, and Vin, who is a street urchin, kind of finds herself with a family. If you're someone that is looking to get into more adult fantasy, I always recommend the Mistborn trilogy, because for me personally, it's what got me back into reading adult fantasy. Then the other book that got me into reading, and once again, this was a book that I saw on the shelf at the store I worked at and ended up picking it up, is actually The Maze Runner by James Dashner. This is a YA dystopian adventure type story, and I remember just eating these books up. I remember sitting in my car on my break at work one day just reading this book because I really, really loved it so much. But this follows a world, or follows a main character named Thomas, and he wakes up one day and has no memory of where he is, and he finds himself in this maze with all of these other boys, and they are tasked every day with trying to get out of the maze and find their freedom. And then one day, like, a girl shows up, and it's only ever been boys. So they have to figure out who put them in this maze, why, and what exactly is going on in the world outside, which we soon learn is very post-apocalyptic-like. And this ignited my love for post-apocalyptic type stories, stories that involve viruses or plagues or human experimentation and any type of dystopian type elements. This series for me was just so much fun, and it was definitely a segue into more adult dystopian stories. The Maze Runner kind of led me into wanting to read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Now, this was a book I was familiar with. I remember a girl that I knew in college, this was her favorite book. But like I said, this is 7 or 8 years later where I finally read this book, maybe further. I'm sure everyone is familiar with The Handmaid's Tale at this point, but it follows a near-future dystopian society and is located in a place called Gilead. A totalitarian regime has overthrown the US government, and they are incredibly strict with regards to gender roles, and there's a lot going on in this world, and there is declining birth rates. So they implement a lot of practices to help increase the birth rate. Women who are in childbearing years are forced to become handmaids and birth children to the elite of society, which is what our main character is. Her name is Offred, and she is currently a handmaid. But the thing that I like about this book is it has a lot of feminist themes. I'm personally not one that seeks out books that specifically have feminist themes. That's just a personal preference for me. But what I liked about this book was the portrayal of a dystopian society and how it does oppress one specific group of people. This book touches on a lot of themes such as gender roles, oppression, resistance, power. And I also even like how it touches on things such as literacy, because in this world, the women are not taught to read or anything like that. And as a teacher, that kind of stuck with me. So this book definitely stops and makes you think, and it's a big contrast to The Maze Runner, but still has those elements of dystopian, and made me want to read more adult dystopian. As for the book that got me into reading science fiction, it was actually The Martian by Andy Weir. And I had read a couple of YA sci-fi books, but if you're talking about a book that is more hard sci-fi than a YA book, then it was definitely The Martian. And I can actually attribute this to the movie, because I watched the movie before I read the book, and the book is just a completely different experience. If you're not familiar with the premise of The Martian, we're following a character named Mark Watney. He is an astronaut, and he is a botanist, if I remember correctly, and they are on Mars. And his crew ends up having to evacuate due to an emergency, and he gets left behind. So he has to survive for several years, because it takes many years for a ship to get from Earth to Mars before he can be rescued. So as a botanist in a very unforgiving and hostile environment, he has to grow plants and survive and eat and all of this. And we're basically following his journey. This book, for a sci-fi book, I found to be very accessible. And I keep saying that word because if you're someone that is trying to get back into reading, you want books that are not overly complicated. And what I liked about this book is Andy Weir would actually step by step go with you through the thought processes of Mark Watney as he is doing a specific thing to help in his survival. And he will actually step by step go through the scientific process with you, which after a while, it could get a little bit textbooky, but I understand why Andy Weir was doing it. And the thing that I really like about Andy Weir's writing is the fact that he can throw humor into his books, which makes sometimes dry scenes or dry situations more bearable. And his main character, like, he was alone for several years and he didn't know if he was going to die on Mars by himself. And yet he still kept a positive outlook and humor and everything despite his circumstances. So it was just a well-crafted novel. It was invented and it made me want to read more sci-fi. Then I have two similar books that got me into reading contemporary with a little bit of romance. And they're very similar in their plots, which I think is why I like them so much. So the first one is actually Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmer. This is a YA contemporary with romance thrown in. And I actually saw this book on booktube. So I don't remember who was talking about it. So this is definitely a booktube recommendation. We are following Juliet and Declan. Juliet's mother died a year ago in a car accident. And every single day she visits her mother's grave and she writes letters to her mother. Declan's a very troubled youth, and due to something that he did, he is serving community service at the cemetery. One day he comes across Juliet's letters and decides to write her back, and the two of them begin this anonymous correspondence and develop feelings for one another and find out that they have a very deep connection. What I enjoyed about this book was its exploration of grief. These two characters actually are going through a lot of the same things, and both of them are experiencing their own forms of grief. And this book also explores a lot of things that teenagers face, such as developing an identity, coming into their own, dealing with emotional wounds, as well as how people judge them. So the fact that they are able to confide in one another and develop a connection was really sweet. And obviously, as these books tend to go, the two of them do learn the identity of one another, and then there are some issues that surround that. But this book actually was very emotional, and it did break my heart a little bit. And whenever a book affects me emotionally, that is definitely a good writer in my opinion. So if you are looking for a book that will give you an emotional reaction and make you want to read more or make you want to read similar books, then Letters to the Lost is a great place to start. Because of Letters to the Lost, I ended up picking up The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker, which is in the similar vein with regards to the plot. In this book, we are following a main character named Kala, and she is going to Alaska because her father lives in Alaska. She has a very estranged relationship with her father. He has never been in her life, but he's been sick. So she decides to go and visit him, and he is a pilot in Alaska. So Kala decides to go to Alaska and visit her father. And there she meets a pilot named Julian who thinks that Kala is treating her father so badly and he doesn't like her, but what Julian doesn't know is that Kala's father was never really in her life and she has a lot of resentment towards him. And then we have Julian and Kala who end up overcoming their preconceived notions about each other and developing feelings for one another. A relationship ensues. But then you have the other part of the plot where Kala has to decide if she wants to forgive her father, have a relationship with her father, and then because he's sick, obviously there is some grieving involved in this book too. So this book really captivated me for several reasons. We have a beautiful setting, which is Alaska, really made me feel like I was there. And the fact that the author was able to incorporate a slow burn, passionate romance, in addition to having our main character go through regret and grief and all of these other strong emotions, just made for a very emotionally explosive book, and definitely one that pulled at my heartstrings. And okay, you guys, so those are all books that got me back into reading or got me to explore new genres that I didn't used to read. So if you are someone that wants to start reading fantasy or get back into reading fantasy, definitely give Cassandra Clare or Brandon Sanderson a go. If you are someone that's looking to get into sci-fi, I do recommend Andy Weir. I think that he is very accessible. And then as always, if you are looking for a dystopian book, I started out with YA dystopian. There is a ton of YA dystopian books from The Hunger Games, The Maze Runner, Divergent, Divergent, all of those are great. And then you can segue into more adult-themed dystopian like The Handmaid's Tale. And then I'm not a big contemporary book reader. I'm definitely not a big contemporary romance book reader, but I do like books that incorporate multiple themes in addition to the romance, and Letters to the Lost and The Simple Wild both managed to do that. So these are all books that I highly recommend among specific genres. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and let me know in the comments if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, or if you have any book recommendations that are very similar to any of these that I talked about in this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video soon. Goodbye!